Alright, listen up. The orcs don't worship their gods like stupid other kids do. We ain't got no robies or build big fancy sheds. We honour the gods by crumping other kids' stupid statues. The orcish statues are tall walkers with round metal feet where hordes of boys gather round and rush to the fire, shouting, "Here we go, here we go, here we go." Gork and Mork is our gods, and their fighting is the best. Gork is brutal but cunning, and Mork is cunning but brutal. They are the biggest, toughest gods, stronger than them other runs. They laugh at other punier gods. We orcs are the biggest stomping war anywhere, and as we were, they were in the Great Green. You me's and pointy ears got weird soft feelings that sorta do the same. But their zogging weak feelings ain't proper fighting like ours. Gork's the favourite boss of war bosses and knobs, goths and snakebites, and any orc what likes stomping gits without mucking about. He's a massive load of brutal, a wild storm of hammering fists, kicking feet and tusks sticking out in a noisy never-ending roar. He crumps as we crump, and his happy fighting keeps us going. However, when a mech gets thinking for a new cabin, or a blood axe gets a sneaky plan, or a death scout spots a chance to nick something or stab a git in the back, that's the work of Mork. Mork likes brutal cunning and fighting, but he's a canny git. He is the obsessive thinking in every odd boy, the devious gleam in a grot's eye, and the fang-filled chomping leer of a commando right for he springs his ambush. Mork is orky cunning made real, and he delights every time we get one over on those squishy, weakling, beakies, bug-eyes or spikies. In the Gargants and the Stompers, we see the gods. We be building these massive tents in their image. A mech boy's axe work proves the orky way. Just like the gods, lumbering about with ground-shaking steps, leaving a beautiful trail of crumping. They go where they please, and they always want a good scrap. A Gorkanok for Gork, and a Morkanok for Mork, you see. The lads inside these huge stompy tin copies get visions of Gork, or maybe Mork, telling them to go harder in the scrap. Now that Gork's green grin has bust open the stars, the war yells of the Orc gods ring out louder and clearer. In the Great Green, the Orc gods smash odds of gits with every thump. They know that soon that grin'll open wide, and then, at last, they'll burst out of the green and show the way in the Great War.
Hello everybody, hello and welcome back to Terra. I hope you appreciated my fantastic orc voice there. That was a fair few takes, but I think I did all right there. That is actually an insight into an upcoming video I've been working on, and it's been a lot of research. I've been trying to find quotes about all kinds of gods in Warhammer 40k, and there was one aspect of Gork and Mork in particular. God damn. Bloody hell. All right. There was one aspect of Gork and Mork in particular that I thought was really interesting and I really wanted to talk about. So today, we're going to take a look at some pretty old Warhammer 40k lore. It's old lore, but it checks out. It still checks out. From like one of the first Orc codexes. It's just called like WA. And in this Orc codex, we get a deep dive into Gork and Mork, really, in terms of how Gork and Mork were created, how they operate within the warp, myths around Gork and Mork, and their relationships with both the Chaos Gods and, in addition to that, the Emperor of Mankind. And amazingly, we get this fantastic passage which basically talks about this idea, as you'll see, that the Emperor of Mankind is concerned and worried about Gork and Mork. So let's take a look.
On distant Earth, a living corpse in a golden throne opened eyes that held fear for the first time in centuries. The Emperor knew that he must save his people. If Gork and Mork unleashed their hordes, then any unprepared worlds would be swept aside by a green tide of death. The Emperor bent his thoughts to the task. Across human space, within the range of the Astronomicon, Imperial Tarot began to foretell disaster. Commanders consulting them found all the signs of impending catastrophe on a cosmic scale. In the Segmentum Obscura, battle fleets were recalled and prepared for war. On the homeworlds of the Adeptus Astartes, Space Marines reached for their weapons, knowing their time of destiny was near. On the edge of the Eye of Terror, the Ordos of the Adeptus Titanicus roused their ancient war machines. Having surveyed his empire and seen it was ready, the dying immortal within the Golden Throne prepared himself for the conflict to come.
It's very exciting, as you might imagine, and it takes place in this passage where we also get this kind of insight into the idea of Gork and Mork kind of awakening, this idea that perhaps they haven't really been present in the galaxy very much, and now they're starting to move forward. And that weirdly does tie in quite well with like modern 40k lore, because in the recent Orc novels there weirdly is a kind of philosophical debate that goes on around Ghazghkull, which I think is inspired by a very real philosophical conundrum, which is basically the idea of like divine silence, divine hindrance. And the Orcs have noticed that, hey, if Gork and Mork are supposedly real, then how come they don't make themselves known? How come, Gork's grin isn't opening wide? And there's even this suggestion that perhaps the Orcs, or at least, well, that there is this discussion between Ghazghkull and Grotznik at the end of Grotznik the Mad Dog, where Grotznik and Ghazghkull make it pretty clear that they're aware of something that most races in the galaxy aren't, which is that when it comes to the gods, they're not really gods. And in fact, the specific truth, which is Gork and Mork are created by the Orcs, not the other way around. Whereas, of course, most Orcs believe not just that Gork and Mork created the Orcs, but they're the truth, they're the way through to things like reincarnation. And Ghazghkull has actually become aware of this, which has only made him more powerful, because his strength, his power is closely connected, as you might imagine, to Gork and Mork. The more powerful they become, the more powerful the Orcs become, the more powerful Ghazghkull becomes, because Ghazghkull is basically the center. He is the prophet of the Great War. So really interesting little tie-in here, but when we see this passage in the old lore of Mork and Gork kind of awakening, we get to see them really do some incredible things. They beat the crap out of Nurgle. They literally like beat him to a pulp, and they're just kind of like batting Slaanesh aside.
Gork struggled towards awareness. After centuries of dormancy, it was a long process. He sensed other powers in the warp, trying to interfere. He blocked a subtle tendril from Slaanesh, ignored a baleful warning from the Emperor, discounted the triumphant cry of Khorne. He reached out with his millennia-old mind and gathered the strength of his people. Soon he would awake and be active. A body of steel had been prepared for him. A time of blood and iron was approaching. Mork moved on the face of the warp, brushing aside demons and ignoring ancient barriers set by long-dead gods. He moved from world to world and placed in the heart of every Orc the desire to be restless, to move, to follow the siren call of adventure when it came. He sensed other powers subtly striving to oppose him, and laughed as their attempts to restrain his crude, irresistible purpose. Beyond them, they sensed the Chaos powers watching, waiting to see what advantage the God Brothers' actions might bring them. In the darkest pits of creation, twisted creatures prepared to follow the Orcs' advance. Gork and Mork did not care. They knew they were strong enough to resist chaos.
So there we have it. Gork and Mork, strong enough to push back against the old four. We see them bat Slanesh aside. We see them beat the absolute bejesus out of Nurgle. And there's even kind of references to them really kind of hunting things throughout the warp and really not being concerned about how powerful the Chaos Gods are, which is pretty cool. And the reason I think this is very interesting is because we get so little lore on Gork and Mork in modern Warhammer 40k, not like we do when it comes, of course, to the Emperor or the Chaos Gods, and they don't seem to be nearly as active as the other gods are, especially once you discount Ghazghkull, and Ghazghkull's kind of his own individual character. So just some amazing lore there. I thought I'd mention it for you all today. Hope you're all doing well. Chat, how's things? I hope everyone's good. The Chaos Gods will checkmate each other. The Eldar Gods are basically dead. The Orc Gods are just there for the lulz, so I don't see who stands out. I guess, yeah, broadly speaking, that's true. But I mean, now we're in the age of story and not a setting. So I think realistically, the idea that we would see Gork and Mork do more in the future, I think is pretty likely. I think there's a good chance that Games Workshop will dive more into those aspects in the future. And certainly, Games Workshop do have this big penchant, this big love of dragging up old Warhammer 40k lore. So when like reading old codexes and even reading like Rogue Trader and all this kind of old lore, especially even though a lot of it is mad, it is quite relevant because Games Workshop do like to bring things through as much as possible. Litu being probably the most ridiculous example, but something that, as we've discussed on the channel at length, is very important by the time we get to the end of the Horus Heresy. So it's kind of, it's kind of amazing to see all this kind of old lore that like, you know, reading this old lore, it gives you an indication of what may come in the future. And the Orcs have been getting a decent amount of love in recent years. So hopefully we get more of it. I think the Emperor of Mankind is currently the most powerful individual god in 40k. Me too, and I actually make that case basically upcoming, so I won't dive too much into it now, but yes, I'm very much in the same vein as that. The only person more powerful than the Emperor of Mankind is, of course, the Emperor of Mankind. That's a sneak peek. I think Gork and Mork are strong, but anytime they are fighting each other, they are fighting 2-on-1. So I feel like they aren't as strong as everyone acts like they are. Yes and no. I guess the problem is that you are right in that there's two of them, but at the same time, they are they're mythology, right? They're gods. They're not supposed to really make sense. So the idea that it's 2-on-1 is kind of true, but also they're both just the reflection of the York kind of Gestalt's consciousness. So they are two beings, but they're sort of one being. And I guess that becomes quite apparent because one is brutal and cunning and the other is cunning and brutal. So it's, yeah, they're two, but they're also one. They're both Alfarius at the end of the day. I'd love to see Gork and Mork have a scrap with Khorne, and we definitely need more love for Tusker Demon Killer. Yes, Tusker Demon Killer is, if you're not familiar with Tusker Demon Killer, he is a relatively old piece of Warhammer 40k lore. It does get repeated in later codexes, so it's definitely canon, where he ended up going into the Eye of Terror after he'd run into a demon because he wanted to have a good scrap. And when Tusker Demon Killer got killed and his boys, they got resurrected by Khorne just to fight over and over again because Khorne found them entertaining. And so it's definitely canon lore, and it definitely is the kind of thing I could see Games Workshop using in the future. It's of the many MacGuffins in Warhammer 40k, that is one of the more popular ones. So I guess we can hold out hope. Oh boy, my favourite working companion. My Warhammer knowledge is severely outdated about everything related, but I like listening to this guy while writing things. Well, most of the lore talked about today is pretty old lore, so I imagine you'll be more familiar with it, believe it or not. But yeah, it's kind of it's one of those fascinating little places where sometimes you can get tempted, if it's just older lore, to just kind of discount it. But because there is so little lore on Gork and Mork, the stories of Gork and Mork interacting with the Chaos Gods, for example, are basically the only stories that we have of that. And so it's, yeah, you can't really discount it entirely, because what are you replacing it with? Meister, what is known about the fate of Garrow and the founding of the Grey Knights? Does the Emperor's gene seed make them psychics? So Garrow doesn't become a Grey Knight. He does get offered, he doesn't get offered to become a Grey Knight, and he has his own story in the Siege of Terra, where he ultimately will be killed fighting his demon Primarch father, Mortarion, and his soul ultimately will get saved by the burgeoning Imperial cult, which is pretty cool. And so he gets a pretty awesome death and one last final day where he stands up against his father. As to the founding Grey Knights, so we do see that's in the book Buried Dagger. I need to do a reading of that passage at some point, because it is a really good one. When the Emperor, it's one of the times the Emperor comes off the Golden Throne, and he just gets to speak to them through like this what's it called, revelation. And when the Emperor speaks to them, he gives a really big speech, and Malkador basically lets them know about the dangers of chaos and how they need to create a new weapon. The creation of the Grey Knights is largely Malkador's decision, Malkador's creation, because the Emperor is on the Golden Throne and they can sort of communicate, but sort of can't communicate. The heresy is pretty inconsistent around that. And when they are created, Loken is offered to be a Grey Knight and he rejects it, but the rest of them do. As to whether his gene seed makes them Psykers. So when the Emperor speaks to the founding Grey Knights, he says he's going to forge them into weapons. And Loken, for example, we know, was not a Psyker. He actively says that multiple times. Now, there is some suggestions in the lore that maybe Loken just didn't understand or something like that. Like he is able to kind of communicate with Malkador when Malkador's on the Golden Throne, which you could point to like maybe Loken was a Psyker all along. But I do quite just like the idea that the Emperor would just forge them into Psykers. And so yeah, I think that whilst the modern day Grey Knights would all be Psykers, the original founding members, I think some of them wouldn't have been Psykers. And the Emperor's gene seed, or at least the process through which they became Grey Knights, literally made them into Psykers. However, there are multiple Psykers amongst their ranks. But yes, it's a surprise. Like Loken is kind of the stickler there, because Loken is he says multiple times, "I'm not a Psyker," and yeah, they repeat that even after he's offered to join the Grey Knights. So it's kind of a weird one. But yeah, I think you can read it two ways. You can either read it that the Emperor could have literally made Loken into a Psyker, or you could read it that Loken was a Psyker all along and he just didn't really realize, or something like that. It's up to you. Another super chat. We've been getting more lore with major/minor warp gods as physical warp beings with described forms. Should we expect to see Gork and Mork illustrated in the warp or the materium first, if at all? The other recent mention of Gork and Mork in 140k, to your point there, is perhaps the book Mortis. So in the book Mortis, there's this we get, like in a lot of the Horus Heresy Siege of Terror books, we get to see the Emperor and Horus having like a conversation within the warp. And often the Emperor is mute in these conversations and it's just Horus doing a villain monologue. But in that book, when the Emperor and Horus communicate, there are the 4 Chaos Gods that are described, but then there's 2 other background beings that are also there. And some people think, oh, well, maybe that's a reference to Vashtor or, other potential Chaos Gods in the future. But the other option, of course, is that it is Gork and Mork, because Gork and Mork should be active at the time. They should be around, and they would presumably be interested in the biggest scrap that's ever happened. So I imagine, yeah, that's another way you could read it. And I think Gork and Mork is perhaps the simpler explanation of the two, which makes it more likely to be correct, in my opinion. What was the other question? Should we expect to see them illustrated? Yeah, I mean, there are very few illustrations of them at all. I think part is because from an artist's impression, they are basically just going to look like big orcs. Is presumably what they would actually manifest as. But yeah, hopefully we get more on it. I think that they should do. I guess it's a slight challenge in terms of there's that crossover with AOS. So if any lore they add to Gork and Mork kind of has to apply to both. There might be some exceptions to that, like Slanesh being imprisoned in AOS or whatever. But generally speaking, the things you're going to do in one setting, you're going to want to do in both. So it's a tough one. But yeah, hopefully we get more illustrations of them. Is Gaz the King in Yellow? I doubt it, but nice King in Yellow mention there. Thanks, guys. We appreciate the voices. What about the king in purple? They're sneaky, you want never seed. I mean, hey, it's always possible. If there's a potential third Alpha Legion Primarch, a potential third purple Orc God is, yeah, I mean, it's got to be on the cards, right? Zeech wills it. He already won the great game, but chose to let the game continue playing. Heavily biased opinion, but I will allow you to believe that if you'd like to. I personally think that, and again, this is one of those things about Zeech that I think makes him, he can get a bit boring if you're just going to make Zeech so much more powerful than everybody else, and he's just on top of everything, and he's just already won. I think he becomes less interesting as a character. Do you know what I mean? I think Zeech becomes more interesting as a character, as a god that has a lot more weaknesses than you might suppose, and yeah, he just doesn't know how to deal with it. The Orcs are the only good guys in the 40k universes. I mean, there is a sympathy to have towards the Orcs, because of course they are engineered war creatures. You know, I mean, we talk about our child soldiers in 40k, but the Orcs were bred for war. So it's yeah, there's definitely some sympathy that we can have for them. Alpharius was so pushy for destroying the Orcs in the Horus Heresy that it was on Horus's list of stresses. Biggest mistake of the GC and the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy was failing to finish them off. Yes and no. It's a good question. Is it a good one of their biggest failings? Like, objectively, it was a huge problem because they ended up coming back stronger and nearly destroying the Imperium in the War of the Beast. But the problem is actually completely destroying the Orcs is incredibly hard, and I don't know how long it would have taken for the Great Crusade to do that. I don't think there's an estimation for how they could have done it, because Orc spores, you know, you need to really scour a planet to make sure there's no resurgence. So you're right, like it is a failing in terms of it had devastating consequences, but could they even have done it, I guess, is the question. Is there much lore on the Emperor's thoughts about Gork and Mork? Outside of what I played you, I've never read anything else. Old Ones failing was concerning the wiping of the greenskins. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, they probably couldn't do. I mean, I get, in terms of whether it's technically impossible to wipe out the Orcs, I would guess it's not technically impossible, which is I don't think the Great Crusade could have done it without a much longer time. Like, even if the Emperor had succeeded in, you know, unifying the galaxy, I still think the Orcs would still take centuries more to properly wipe out, or maybe even millennia more, because they're just a good, yeah, you gotta get rid of all those spores. Did you ever get around to reading the Grotznick short story from the 2026 Black Library celebration? I don't think so. I'll make a note of that. I guess that's a precursor. Maybe if it was included in the, maybe I'll double check. How prominent do you speculate Orcs were during the Dark Age of technology? There are references to humanity at the time fighting against the Xenos races, so presumably that included the Orcs, and they were beaten into a relatively almost wiped out state. But I guess that's another good comparison. Is the Orcs would have definitely made themselves known to humanity, and the humanity in the Dark Age of technology couldn't wipe them, so it's unlikely the Emperor could have done. Gork and Mork, when they both see the Emperor, finally a worthy opponent. Our battle shall be legendary. The Emperor, oh hell nah. So interestingly, that's a pretty consistent piece of Warhammer lore, I think, across the codexes, which is that the idea that the Orcs are aware of the Emperor. They don't know exactly what he looks like, and there is this lore around the idea that when the Orcs think of the Emperor of mankind, they think of a giant Titan-sized warlord, because that's the way they assume the Emperor would manifest. But yes, the actual lore of the meme lore of whether the Orcs empower the Emperor, there's no canon lore around that. That is just fan fiction, I'm afraid, but fun. Aren't the Orcs a direct hard counter to the Necron Stormlord because they just operate in total chaos? Chaos in quotation marks. I mean, the Necrons never, I guess we never saw them try to delete the orcs from the galaxy, but I would guess they do a pretty good job. They have some, at their peak, they have a lot of weaponry that can scour a planet, so I imagine they can make that work, to be fair. If the Emperor and the gods are powered by faith, and if the orcs believing something to be true will make it reality, then do you think the orcs' belief in power of the Emperor also power him? That is a very popular 40k theory, and it doesn't say that isn't the case in the books, but I highly doubt that is true. I think that it would be somewhat undermining of the Emperor's arc to go from very powerful perpetual to the most powerful being in the galaxy to a being who splits his soul into two to being the most powerful person in this realm or any other realm. I think to say it was because of the orcs might undermine that journey somewhat, but as an orc fan, no one can stop you from believing that. I feel like the orcs fear the Emperor. I feel like the orcs' fear of the Emperor absolutely plays a role in his power, but not as much as the warp magic he already is. I mean, in theory, it should do something. Yeah, that's true. You're all right. Do you think that Yarrick is only still alive because of the collective belief of the orcs? Yes, that and Space Wolf, the First Aid. but yes, I mean, presumably it would empower him. That is true. If there's enough orcs believing it, then it would have some effect. But maybe the only reason he's alive, I guess, you know, I do like the idea that he's just a guy who just fucking, he's just sheer willpower. I think Gork and Mork are memories of Krork warlords, but it's clearly based on Romulus and Remus or Hengst and Horsa style myths. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with Romulus and Remus, but maybe there is something there. I guess there's so little lore on them. What was really interesting about reading the War book was that there's a lot more, as an English person or a British person, you probably notice it more. There's a lot more satirical commentary about the way football fans are mocked, basically by orcs in 40k, or the writers when they made the orcs. I know orcs fight with demons in the warp, but I don't know if Hugh meets Eldar or whoever meets Gork and Mork in the warp. In theory, it's possible. No sign of it as of yet. Are the orcs awakening also to fight the Necrons, the enemy they were made to fight in the first place? There's not too much on it. I mean, obviously they do fight each other when they appear, but in terms of like Gazgul believing that he should lead a great war against the Silent King to empower himself, that hasn't happened yet. But it makes total sense. There's no, it totally checks out. And if Gazgul can develop a slight understanding of how the Krork work, it does match on that he would want to go and challenge the Silent King, because he would make himself a lot more powerful in doing so. So since Armageddon has been overrun by orcs, isn't that a really big issue since it's in the solar sector? I mean, it is an important world, but it's not been entirely lost just yet, as 11th edition will undoubtedly play out. As long as they get both Gazgul and Angron on Armageddon at the same time, I'll be happy. That would be cool. That would be cool. In the End of the Death, the Emperor and Horus pass through the cemetery of dead gods. Yes, also I should say, when in the old Orc lore, when Gork and Mork are kind of waking up, I think Gork does walk past all these kind of dead gods and gods he'd like allied with before, apparently, and that kind of thing. So there is this suggestion that, just like we've seen in AOS, perhaps Gork and Mork did have a more complicated history than you might suspect. Do you think the orcs can actually threaten Terra at this point, like in the War of the Beast? It's not impossible. I mean, I think that Gazgul is an incredibly powerful and kind of unique orc being, but the beasts in the War of the Beast are also incredibly smart, and I guess Gazgul has a long way to go to reach that level. Who did the orcs in the war? How did the orcs in the War of the Beast get that powerful? Same concept with Gazgul. They're just the most powerful boss. Gazgul seems to be something a bit different because of how Grotsnik made him, But yes, they're just the most powerful war boss, and they get so powerful. They're incredibly intelligent. They can speak High Gothic, and they can strategize. And yeah, there's a big twist where it turns out there's actually more of them. But I will say at the end of the War of the Beast book series, there is a prophecy from Eldrad where he foresees Ghazghkull. So they know Ghazghkull is supposed to be of a beast level. In Vulcan's Primarch novel, there's an Orc warlord that goes toe-to-toe with him and nearly wins. At this point, Ghazghkull should be at a Primarch level, or he's just an inferior to what's already been. I think he is, generally speaking, seen to be inferior to what's already been. I mean, not just Vulcan's Primarch novel, but in the Wolf of Ash and Fire, there's an Orc that has the power to kill the Emperor, and according to, I think it was Graham McNeil, the Emperor's life genuinely was in danger at that point. For the Emperor, winning against Orcs would be easy if he could just convince them he's unbeatable, and the Orcs believing it would make it so. You should read Warlord of Warlords. Ghazghkull makes it through some pretty wild shit. I have started Warlord of Warlords, and yeah, all good so far. The current lore I hate. I felt there should be a bigger consequence to Tyranid/Orc war and lore. I think they could bring back, because it's one of my favorite short stories, is Sons of Malice. Interesting. The Octarius War is what you're thinking, I'm guessing. And should it bring back Sons of Malice? I mean, Sons of Malice are still about. There's still a faction in the setting. They haven't mentioned Malice in any like meaningful book since then, but the Sons of Malice as a faction are around. I think the thing that is, because I think that sometimes I see people say things like, oh, Sons of Malice is still definitely a prominent character in the setting or canon or whatever, because the Sons of Malice have been mentioned in all of these books. But the problem is that if you actually read those books, when the Sons of Malice are mentioned, Malice is never mentioned. That's kind of concerning. So yeah, there we have it. I mean, it is older Warhammer 40k lore, but it is still canon. The Emperor was pretty concerned, scared even, of Gork and Mork, and I think there's a good way that Games Workshop could bring this through to modern Warhammer 40k lore, because at the end of the day, we do want to see more of the Orcs. And the Orc books have been doing phenomenally well in recent years. And a lot of that most of that old Orc lore does still hold up well. So I hope we get to see more on Gork and Mork. I would love to get a proper passage, more insight into how not just the Emperor, but other characters in the setting view Gork and Mork, view the ultimate threat that like Ghazghkull or someone like that could pose within the setting. It's a fascinating little aspect of Warhammer 40k lore. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Thanks for watching this stream. If you could help me appease YouTube's machine spirit by liking and subscribing, I would greatly appreciate it. If you couldn't make the stream live but want to ask me a question anyway, consider posting it in our community tab and I'll answer it next time. To support the channel, click the join button below, which will give you access to more content, and you can drop into the members Discord where all the coolest Terrans hang out, away from the watchful eyes of the Inquisition. Thanks for joining me, and until next time, I wait for you and I forgive you. Good night.